Okay, so it's great to see you. Great to see people I think are going to be joining online. Um, I, our talk is always looking a little bit about Jewish history, and we'll learn a little bit Jewish history and application to today. We usually try to learn about a particular figure in history. Hello. We learn about a particular figure in history, learn about their life, their education, their works, and then try to apply it to a particular issue today. So today, we're going to learn about Rabbi Israel Salanter. Rabbi Israel Salanter. His actual name was Lipkin. Lipkin. First from Salant. He was from the city of Salant. But interestingly, and I think it's related, one of the heads of the IDF 2 or 3 ago, name was Amnon Lipkin Shachak. And he was the Ramatkal, the head of the entire Israeli army. And
some generals, my brother.
really?
I know.
Oh, okay.
Did you know?
Yeah, I mean, there was their famous family. One of them was the Supreme Court justice. Yeah, yeah, but mhm. Yeah. So that was maybe yeah.
But it didn't.
Really? That's cool. So we had so but his name was Rabbi Israel Lipkin, and he was known as the founder of what's called the Musar movement. But what we're going to end up talking about is a very, very important topic that is very much in the conversation today and has changed in its, which is the concept of mental health, the importance of mental health. Yeah. But he is a really, really important figure to learn about his, I think, visionary approach in many ways. And we'll talk about very specific examples and then apply it to discussions today. So he was born in 1810 in Lithuania. And it's really important to understand in a broader, I guess I'd call it geopolitical context, what's going on in the intellectual Jewish history at the time, what's going on in the Jewish world right then. And I would basically say for that around 100 years, a civil war, really a civil war in many ways in the Jewish world. Not anybody shooting guns at each other, but two such significantly divergent philosophies that led to major fights, basically from the 17 and 1800s in really powerful ways that changed a little today. So there, as you know, have always been a variety of denominations or splinter movements or different styles in Jewish world forever. Many times they took very divergent paths. So for example, this was a time that people called the Jewish Enlightenment, which was nicknamed the Haskalah. And that approach, and before that, in the times of Rishonim, they were often called the Philosophim, the philosophers. That approach often really diverged, where one approach focused on the intellectual pursuit of Jewish peoplehood that was not based on religious practice, meaning the Maskilim were very intellectual, thought deeply about many things, but generally didn't actually practice Jewish halacha. And so there was a very clear demarcation line between those who were what they would call themselves a more traditionalist bent and those who are in the camp of the Maskilim. This was an example where you had groups that both considered themselves within the religious sphere. Beginning, the main figures you'll hear about were the Vilna Gaon, who is now, again, we're going back well over 100 years before then, and the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov, by the way, Baal Shem Tov is actually a nickname for a healer, a doctor. Baal Shem Tov. That wasn't initially his name. His first name was Yisrael Baal Shem. But he was known as the founder of the Hasidic movement. Now, what were the reasons and the background for these movements? So, as you can very well imagine, and especially in Eastern Europe, Jewish life was not a simple and peaceful endeavor. There were pogroms and there was horrible poverty. Yeah, it was a very, very difficult time for many Jewish communities. Again, we'll talk, especially in Eastern Europe, it was really bad. Hello, great to see you. And the other thing that was very interesting was that there was not necessarily mass literacy. The average Jewish family were often very traditional and were very community focused, but not everybody was very well educated. People were poor, and not everybody could afford significant education. And so you definitely had a large group of people who were not particularly well versed in the depths of, Jewish tradition, Jewish law. They were very traditional. They kind of followed what they knew from the Alpaheim, the Minhagim, but we're not necessarily, all this and like that in terms of analysis of the halacha in many ways. And so you saw a group that was the term that they use in history as immiserated, from the word miserable. They had a really tough life, a really, really very difficult life. And there were many Jewish leaders who saw that talking about the number of inches that need to be on the tippy top of a lulav was not getting to these people. It was not inspiring them. It was not bringing them feeling of deep personal, emotional connection. And so, again, I'm obviously oversimplifying, but what you ended up happening was a whole group of this movement that did not drop and not say we're not going to be religious anymore in terms of religious practice, but did say we're going to much more focus on the emotional experience. The idea of music, the idea of simcha, of happiness, of emotional connection to the religious practice ended up becoming a much more significant part of the Hasidic movement. Now, there are also a lot of other elements. One of them was the rise of the focus of the Rebbe, not Rabbi, but the Rebbe, the Hasidic Rebbes. And they had almost like a regal or a monarchical bearing, right? They're like a king. And it would actually go from father to son. And the leadership ascribed to the Rebbe was different than almost any other time in Jewish history over the last 1,000 years, which was, there was almost this feeling of the Rebbe having a religious significance, almost like a conduit to God in very, very significant ways. And so part of it was a very strong need for people to feel a part of something, feel connected. And the Rebbe would give brachos, and people would feel, in a time where life was just so horrible, so real terrible, people really needed something to grab onto. And it was a really significant time. Now, this was incredibly controversial because you had the quote unquote traditionalist group who ended up being called the mitnagdim, which means the opposers, the opposition. They opposed this approach. First of all, they felt like, the almost, I guess the term they used was worship of the Rebbe was too much. They felt like it was not religiously appropriate to venerate and almost worship somebody so much. They felt that was not appropriate, even though, the idea of a Talmid Chacham is important. The other thing they said is, whenever you go to one extreme, you drop. A yes to one thing is always a no to something else, meaning that the opposing forces against the Hasidic movement, they felt that you focused so much on the, I'll call it kumbaya, right? So much on the experience and the singing, and you end up dropping the actual rules. And there was a very significant focus, for example, on having gold knives for shechting. All these things that were given, it was huge. And then the very strong focus on the mystical. And then this was often known in Lithuania, they called them Litvaks from Lithuania. They very much disapproved of this approach because they said, you end up spending so much on the feeling and the singing and the happy, you don't actually follow the rules. And even more so, there was a concern that the leaders and the people who were adherents of this movement, they said they were actually ended up being ignoramuses. They didn't know anything. They were just charisma, just empty hot air, and didn't really have substance. This was, again, obviously the argument against them. And that was a huge, again, it's harder to say the word civil war, but every shtetl would have a Hasidic community and a Misnagdic community, and sometimes they got along, sometimes they very much didn't get along. And you wouldn't marry from one to the other, like really, really serious rift. Now, the Hasidic movement, they responded by saying, first of all, you're not touching the people. The people really need this. But more importantly, they said, you're going too far in the opposite direction. You're like a robot. You're an automaton. You're like, that's what they would say, the Misnagdim, that you don't care, that you lose all of your emotion and you lose all of your connection to, self-reflection and who you are and what you're all about. And you just focus on the minutia, exactly, the technicalities. And so this was a really, really great debate. And obviously the nuances in one side or the other, and both movements had an influence on each other, meaning the Hasidic movement over the years grew to incorporate much more of a focus on studying halacha. For example, the second and third generation of the Rebbes would also write books, not just of Hasidic thought, but books of halachic analysis. In other words, there was the Shem Shmuel and many others who were great Talmidei Chachamim, were great sages, and they kind of showed their bona fides, their bona fides of their scholarship. So there was very much a push to show that the Hasidic movement wasn't dropping all of the actual following of tradition in any significant way. In the opposite direction, the Lithuanian communities or the Misnagdim communities very much acted in a way, or reacted and showcased a way that they didn't ignore character development, and they didn't ignore emotion, and they didn't ignore what the personal connection to Jewish life. And one of the key forces in that direction was Rabbi Israel Salanter. Rabbi Israel Lipkin was a really key figure within the Lithuanian community, bringing in the notion of this self-reflection and character development. And he founded what was known as the Musar movement. Musar, again, sometimes translated as rebuke, but really it means self-reflection. And he was a great sage and someone who very, very much dealt with and believed in the growth of traditional study, but heavily focused on bringing in ancient works and his own works of character development. And so the Hasidim couldn't, complain that the Misnagdim, that this other group was just like robots that didn't care about, character development or understanding. They very, very much did. And he brought in works. He repopularized works like Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Path of the Just, and a lot of these works that dealt with trying to develop your character. And that was something, he believed that ethical refinement was just as important as scholarship and knowledge, scholarly knowledge. So that was he from within said that, the Hasidim are a little bit right, that we're focusing so much on the scholarship that we're kind of neglecting personal ethics. And so he said, we need to spend time focusing and studying works of ethics and studying and developing ourselves as an ethical person. So he pioneered very regimented study of ethical practice, issues of spending time developing humility within yourself, spending time developing self-control, all of these things. And he created essentially a holistic way of life that included study of all sorts of books, from the library, but also daily, behavior focus. There were those who saw within that even aspects of meditation, things that were not what you would imply or think would be robotic. And he very much, in a very organized way, believed that was a very important part. He died actually in a very interesting place. He died in what's now Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is a Russian province, which is wholly surrounded by not Russia. You can only get in there. You can get there by a boat. You can nowadays you can only get in there. It's a domestic flight with Russia that leaves Russia. So Russia is all over here, and then it was called Königsberg of Prussia. But he was very, very strong in, again, developing the practical halacha, but also, the development of Musar. Now, he believed in the interconnectedness of mind and body and spirit. And you might think that sounds very Hasidic, but he was, again, from within that world. He said that your physical health and your mental health are very much intertwined, and they all come together for your spiritual health. So he said you need to make sure you take care of all of those things. He believed in something that he pioneered known as Cheshbon HaNefesh. Cheshbon HaNefesh, Cheshbon means an accounting of your soul. And he actually had it as a practice every single night. Every single night, you would reflect on the day, and many people did this in writing. They'd write down the good things that happened, the bad things that happened, what they're going to try and do to change, the mistakes that they made over the course of the day. It was like a real regimen, evaluating their thoughts, their emotions. And what was interesting was he created something called Batei Musar. Now, a Beit Musar is similar. You've heard of the word Beis Medrash, Beit Midrash. His was a Beit Musar. The idea was he felt that the way to do this most effectively was to be supported by community. If you are accountable and you're together with other people who are also working on themselves and will hold you accountable, you're much more capable. The chances of your success are much greater when you have a supportive community who are also, developing around you. Now, this is just very either ironic or fascinating, interesting in that it's going full circle, because that's what the Hasidic movement did as well. The idea is you were a Gerer Chassid, right? You were an Alexander Chassid. You were surrounded by a community of people who developed in the same way. So the Misnagdim felt like that was success. That was a good idea as well. And that was, very, very important. And he said that you should engage in, I guess we'd call cognitive behavioral exercises. Do exercises that exercise your spiritual and your mind in any way. And he very much believed and developed that sense of thinking it through your mental health as well as just the technical aspects of what your religious life is. That's in a very broad nutshell, the concept of Rabbi Salanter. Now, he was famous for being extraordinarily punctual, extraordinarily organized, because he was a Litvak in that way, but still developing. So there is a well-known anecdote about him where he, one of the things that was very strong within the Lithuanian community was the separation of the genders. It was, the Hasidic community, sometimes even more. The Hasidic weddings of old, they were in like different rooms, the men and the women. Like even now, Chabad weddings, many Chabad weddings are like this nowadays. That the bride is covered with like a very, very a very thick veil, like really strong separation of the genders, which will be important in a moment. That just happened to be part of their ethos and the way. Anyway, so he was a very, very punctual in his teaching, and he would teach in the yeshiva and the Beit Midrash Musar every day. He would teach also, the halacha and the Gemara and the Talmud, and he would never ever be late to class. At that point, he was moving already to this place to Königsberg, and it was near. I think anyway, the students were students of his, not just in the law, but also trying in the students of character development. So they're waiting and waiting, and he's late to class. And they've never been. So they say, okay, let's go find him. And as they're walking, there was a river in town, and they get to the bridge where they know is the direction where he would be coming from, and they see him on the bridge holding and embracing a young lady.
Oh.
Now, and so they're seeing from afar, but then they say, interestingly, he must know what he's doing. He knows what's going on. And then they leave. Like, okay, now we know where he was. They didn't go and explore. They didn't say what's going, they didn't go and have the curiosity. They went back home and they waited. He comes a little bit late to class, apologized being late to class. And then he continues the class, and they're quiet and they're silent. Finally, at the end, there's one chutzpah, one guy who's like, I can't keep it in. Rabbi, tell me what happened. What's going on? What happened to the story? So he said, here's what happened. I was walking on the way to class, to be on time. And as I'm walking, I get to this bridge, and I'm almost bowled over by this woman rushing past me. And I could see something in her eyes, he says. And I said to this woman, what's going on? And she says, get out of my way. Nothing's going on. And I could see something happening. So I block her. I stand in front of her. I don't allow her to pass. And she says, let me get out of my way, get out of my way, get out of my way. And he says, I will not get out of here. Tell me what's going on. She says, I can't tell you what's going on. I'm not going. And he says, I'm not letting you move till you tell me what's happening. And so the woman says, this is a documented story. The woman says, it's from a Sefer Ma'oros HaGedolim, which is, from a first-hand testimony, says, you got to get out of my way because I'm running to jump off this bridge. She tells him this horrible tale of woe, where she says, I'm a young woman. I had 2 children, and they died within a week of each other. It's a terrible story. And my husband has gone into terrible depression, and he was what they called a balagala. He was a coachman, a wagonman. And he is so depressed that he can't work. So we've had to hire an employee who's going to take his horse and do all the work. And now that eats up all our profits. So we have almost no income. And this morning, the horse died. And I just can't do it anymore. And so, Rabbi, get out of my way. I'm gonna jump. And so he says, I held her hand, which back then was something, as we said, very, very, and that's exactly when the students came, that he was holding her hand. And he said, I held her back from jumping, and he speaks to her. And from mental, she was very agitated. He's able to calm her down. He's able to calm her down and says, your husband is going to get away from his depression. He'll be able to get out of it. And you're going to, God is going to provide. And he says, I'm going to raise the money to buy you a new horse. And so after the class, he went around with his students and they raised money and they bought the woman a new horse. And the story ends that a year later, he was invited to the bris. Yeah. So, but here's the interesting thing, again, a very powerful story. A point about that story, which was he was teaching the idea of the ethical side, right? You could say, what do you mean? She's a woman in that world. How could you talk to a woman and touch a woman? She's a married lady. You can't touch. He knew that there is that sense of the importance of recognizing the mental health aspect. Here is a woman in crisis. And he says, to not help her, that's a term called a chassid shoteh, which means a pious fool. To not help her, say, oh, I can't touch women. I can't talk to women. That was again, so he taught by example in that very way. So he was a very, very strong believer in the recognition of mental health. Now, this came to a fascinating argument between him and one of the greatest of the Lithuanian, Polish sages, pretty much of that entire century, Rabbi Israel Hagen. known as the Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim wrote several books. One of them is called Chafetz Chaim, which is a long treatise on the rules of improper speech, which when he took a very interpersonal issue and analyzed it in great depth. The rules of Lashon Hara. He also wrote a book called Mishnah Berurah, which is like an exposition of basically everything having to do with Jewish daily life. And many other books he wrote about the sacrificial service, many other books, but he wrote this book about a proper speech, and he then sent it around to the leading sages to get their approbation, their haskama, that they should write, So he sent it to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, Rabbi Lipkin. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter says, I'm not going to sign it until I read it. So he says, okay, no problem. He sat and he read it. And then he went back to the Chafetz Chaim. He says, I'm not going to sign it because I disagree with it. And I can't put my name on something that I disagree with. What do you disagree with? He said, showed him chapter and verse. Chapter 32, paragraph 3, I disagree. What is chapter 32, paragraph 3? Chapter 32, it's not actually that, but the particular place in the book, it says the following. It says that if you harm someone through improper speech, really if you harm someone, the only way you can get forgiveness is by asking that person to forgive you. Okay, that doesn't seem particularly controversial, but the subtext is more complex. Subtext says, let's say the person doesn't know that you harmed them. Chafetz Chaim says you still must go and ask forgiveness. What's the story? The story was as follows. There was a fellow who, there are two friends, two neighbors, okay? And they had a dispute, they had a fight about the property line, wherever the property line was going to be, okay? Fine. Dispute gets heated, they're very angry with each other, and it happens to be that one of the neighbors is applying for a job. He's applying for a job, and as he applies for this job, his neighbor goes to the potential employer and says, oh, you're hiring him? He's a no-goodnik. Don't hire him. And of course, the guy shows up in the interview with all his resume, and he doesn't get the job. And he has no idea why he didn't get the job. The employer just says, sorry, we're not interested. Doesn't get the job. Okay, so they move on. Years go by. Years and years go by. The neighbors mend fences, they become good friends again, whatever it may be. And indeed, the son of one gets engaged to the daughter of the other. They're engaged, so now they're not just going to be neighbors, they're going to be mechatanim, that's going to be beautiful, wonderful. Okay, now, the father of the groom has these horrible pangs of guilt. Says it was actually going to be Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. All these years back, the fellow got a different job. All these years back, I did something terrible to you. Terrible to to this person. I ruined his job prospects. I did something horrible to him with improper speech. Do I have to go and ask forgiveness and tell him what I did? He has no idea. He moved on. But if I tell him what I did, what he's probably going to do, he's going to be so angry and so hurt, he's going to break the shidduch and not let our children get married. What do I do? So one of these questions got to the Chafetz Chaim, and the Chafetz Chaim said, the rule is ironclad. The way you get forgiveness for a sin that you've done of improper speech is you ask the person for forgiveness. So you have to go. And yes, he's going to be mad at you and may have consequences, but you must go to this person and say, years and years ago, I ruined your job prospects and you didn't get a job you wanted. And I apologize, and please forgive me. And he may forgive me, you may not, but you must inform him.
You have to specifically say, couldn't you just say, forgive me if I hurt you?
Rabbi Chaim did not felt that that was adequate, and he therefore wrote. So in his book, he writes that this, and so when he sent the letter to the book to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, so says, "I'm not signing off on this." He had a fascinating analysis. He said like this. He said, "Well, if I have a lost object, I lost something, okay, on the other side of your field, right? My wallet was dropped on the other side of your field, and but it's a field of roses, and the only way I can get there is by trampling and ruining all the roses. Can I go and get my wallet and by trampling your roses? I have no right to do that. The fact that my wallet is somewhere else, that's my problem. But I have no right to trample your roses to get what I need." So it's the same thing spiritually. I have a need for atonement for this sin. It's my need. I need to atone for the sin I did of doing that terrible thing with the employer. I have to atone. I've got to get a tshuva. The only way I can do it is by hurting you. I'm not allowed to get my own needs filled by hurting someone else. And therefore, of course, I'm going to have to just live with the fact that I'm not going to be able to do tshuva. But I have no right to hurt you by, as a method of getting what I want. And he said it, that you must keep in mind the mental health of the other individual. And because of that, so he says, I won't sign the book. He said, I won't sign. I disagree with this. I agree with everything else you wrote, but that one thing I disagree with. And so he said, and generally the consensus is, so by the way, this actually happened to a teacher of mine. A teacher of mine was, got a call one day, Erev Rosh Hashanah, from a blocked number. And he got a message from a fake email address saying you're about to get a call from a blocked number. Listen to what happens. A fellow man calls him and says, I have never told anybody this, but I had an affair. And now it's Rosh Hashanah. I don't know what to do. Do I tell my wife about it? It's going to destroy our marriage. What do I do? So it was exactly this issue of the Chavetz Chaim and the Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Of like, do you tell this person what you have done to them? I'm sorry, it was the opposite. Sorry. The lady, it was the lady who called and said I had an affair. And do I tell my husband? And that actually has halacha, and that was part of that issue was, do you inform? Or do you say, listen, I just got to go through sitting at the dinner table for the next million years, having this guilt, but I don't want to destroy our marriage. And this was, an issue that happened that was quoted. It was a very big dispute in halacha about exactly what to do in that situation. Interestingly, I'm not actually, I don't know the end of the story of what he did. He told me the story about it was going on. No, it was going on right then. He didn't respond. So, it would be interesting what you think you should do. Should the lady tell her husband that she had an affair or just continue on with the marriage? Yeah. So it was a really, absolutely, yes. Right, exactly, and that, going forward. So that was, he didn't change the book. That was the opinion that he continued to hold. He said, and that was a little bit of like not the Chavetz Chaim was irrelevant, not careful about that, but he said that this is what the halacha is. The halacha is that, by the way, interestingly, no, it's very clear that this is the halacha. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was the one who was innovating by saying that if it's going to hurt the person, don't do it. But the Gemara very clearly says, it's in a Mishnah, you can't get forgiveness until you appease your friend. And it's going to be a tough thing. You got to tell them. Then you got to hope to try and appease them by doing whatever apologies, etc. Now, no, the Chavetz Chaim felt that that was exactly the issue. That by the way, in contemporary psychology, in the 12-step method, one of the steps is going to find everybody you wronged and telling them about it and making it right. And so the 12-step method has this issue where the person has no idea what you did. Oh, I called you an idiot in front of all these people. I wasn't there. I don't know. Behind your back, I did this or that. The guy didn't know. And now you're telling me this is mine. But the 12-step method has that as a very fundamental part. Like the Chavetz Chaim, not like Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, interestingly. So it was a very, very interesting and very powerful idea of prioritizing that sense of mental health as a key piece. So the question then develops of what exactly do you do when it comes to contemporary mental health? And this led, so this is what would they say today? So this led to really interesting, very contemporary, as there is a rising recognition and understanding of mental health. So we know that according to the halacha, pikuach nefesh, if your life is in danger, you're allowed to violate Shabbat. That is an unequivocal, no questions asked. What happens if your physical life isn't in danger, but your mental health is in danger? Can you violate Shabbat for mental health concerns? So there's 3 gradations, there's 3 levels. There are mental health concerns from somebody who's already seriously ill with some other illness or ailment, and you're worried how their state of mind will affect their current illness. That everyone agrees. So that's a Gemara. The Gemara in Shabbos, 128b, talks about, let's say there is a woman in childbirth, okay? And she is going through labor, and it comes to Shabbos. So it says that you are allowed and required people in the room, they didn't have electric light, to light a candle to make sure that there's light in the room while she's giving birth. And then the Gemara interestingly adds, and this is true even if the pregnant woman is blind.
Well,
Even if she's blind. Right. Why? Says you have to light a candle. Even if you could see, it's not so dark, but you light a candle to assuage her mental health. Now, even if she's blind, why? Because she will feel more comfortable knowing that all of the surgeons and the doctors and the midwives can see really well. And so it's interesting. The Magen Avraham there says, well, then just lie to her. Lie to her. Say, oh, yeah, it's bright light here. He says, no, that won't work because she'll hold up 2 fingers. Say, how many fingers am I holding up? No, but the idea, the point though is it's sort of joke. Exactly. The point though is that it is, you're absolutely, because you're concerned that if her mental state deteriorates, that will cause her. And this is a big issue ethically about, let's say you have someone with a very significant illness. And there was a discussion in mental health, in medical ethics circles. Do you tell them how bad it is?
Yeah.
Do you lie to the patient to give them a better prognosis? Because a big part of your healing is that your mindset. So if you tell a patient, it's going to be fine, then they're going to fight harder. If you tell them, oh, all hope is lost, then maybe they'll give up hope. And so that's an issue. Obviously, each case is much more nuanced. Yeah. That's exactly. So that's a big part. So that's the first level. Then there is mental health for someone who's not ill, but you're worried that if they don't have any physical, but if their mental health deteriorates, they might cause harm to themselves or others. They might do something. There was an interesting story about a rabbi who wrote many books. Back then, they didn't have printing presses. They were all written by hand. And they were in his storehouse, and there was a fire. And part of the argument was we can extinguish the fire even if no person is in danger, because the mental health that his entire library being burnt down will cause him, the mental anguish will kill him. And so that was raised as an issue. But where did this come? Much more contemporary issues, where it's not that you're going to do something, but it's going to lead to depression. It's going to lead, there's going to be a worry, just not about your direct physical health, but just worry about your anxiety. So interestingly, that was generally not, for many, many years, not seen as a halachic consideration. For example, there was a proof used by Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, actually, but he said, maybe you should never give anybody capital punishment, because if you give capital punishment, it'll cause terrible anguish to their family of the convicted. We see that's not the case. We still have capital punishment for murderers or whatever it may be, despite the fact that the murderer's family is going to feel really bad. So we can't just not do anything because it's going to make people feel bad. Exactly. So that's where the two sides of the story comes in. But what's interesting was this came up in two very, very powerful contemporary issues. The first is in COVID. During COVID, where people were horribly isolated. And before, people the world didn't understand the mental health impacts of isolation. And so there was a bunch of discussions. For example, people were very careful. They would never use a phone or a computer on Shabbos, but they were terribly isolated, and their family members wanted them to have the phone or the Zoom on so people could check on them. And one of the arguments used was their mental health is going to be so horribly affected by the isolation that there actually may be an allowance to have people check on them remotely via Zoom, even though COVID is, this was somebody in quarantine. So you couldn't, even if you wanted to, you couldn't go visit them. And so that was one of the issues based on this analysis of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And there were people who said, yeah, if you have to be, but if you have a significant, legitimate professional concern over this person's mental health because of that isolation, there were allowances to do that. Now, the secondary thing that came up, and we'll stop with this, was psychotrauma, right? Since October 7th, it has been such a horribly traumatic time in Israel and in the Jewish community behind the world. So there was a question, the following, which is, when there's a response to a terrorist attack or response to some sort of attack, everybody in the police and the medical and the paramedics and the army, of course, they respond on Shabbos. Can you have psychologists respond on Shabbos also? The argument is they're not saving lives, quote unquote, right? They're not you're digging people under the rubble or getting into combat. They're only there for mental health, quote unquote. That's exactly the point. And in previous generations, this would be a no-brainer. Sorry, give them that, get help them. But the need to do immediate intervention for mental health was seen as so acute that there are now allowances for mental health units to jump into action on Shabbos. And by the way, for sure, for example, there are religious units in the Israeli army who will jump in a car on Shabbos for R&R. Because that's seen as developing their mental health, which will help them on the battlefield. And so even to go to a recreational break from battle, there is allowances to do that on Shabbos, and it all comes back to that point of the nuances of the mental. So again, what we say today, you see the innovative thinking of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter now playing out in very, very practical contemporary issues, which I think is a really, really interesting. And we should all be zocha to good mental health, good physical health, and Yeshua b'nechamot.
And by the way,